In the village where time moves backward, where the ancient stones remember more than the living, there lived a boy named Amara who dreamed in hieroglyphics. The village itself seemed caught between two worlds. Modern buildings of concrete and corrugated metal leaned against structures that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. Amara's home was one of these hybrid places, a modest dwelling with whitewashed walls and a flat roof where his family had lived for generations, always in the shadow of the ancient ruins that defined their landscape. From his small room, he could see the weathered blocks of stone in the distance, remnants of Cairo's forgotten glory, and each dawn they seemed to call to him with a voice he could not quite understand. His days followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. He woke before sunrise when the air still held the coolness of night and made his way to the family's fields. The soil was stubborn but generous, yielding vegetables and grains that sustained his family and provided modest income at the weekly market. His hands, though only 17 years old, bore the calluses of someone who had known work since childhood. Yet his mind wandered constantly from the rows of crops to the mysteries that lay beyond the village boundaries. The evenings were when Amara truly came alive. After the day's labor was finished and the heat had begun its retreat, he would climb to the flat roof of his home and watch the shadows lengthen across the valley. Sometimes his younger sister would join him, bringing tea that their mother had prepared with cardamom and mint, but mostly he sat alone with his thoughts and the whispered stories of the wind. It was on these rooftops that his grandfather would find him, moving with the careful patience of someone who had learned to live in harmony with time itself. His grandfather, Karim, was the keeper of stories. His face was a map of decades, each line and fold containing memories that stretched back further than most people could imagine. He would settle beside Amara with the slowness of ceremony, and together they would watch the day surrender to the night. Then Karim would speak of times when pharaohs ruled the lands, when the stones that surrounded them had been white and gleaming, when the Nile had written the story of civilization itself upon the earth. These stones, Karim would say, his voice like the rustling of papyrus, they remember. They have seen kingdoms rise like the sun and fall like rain. They have stood through centuries, through conquest and restoration, through the forgetting and the remembering. And still they stand, bearing witness. Amara would listen with the intensity of someone receiving sacred knowledge. He asked endless questions about the hieroglyphics that appeared on fragments of pottery in the fields, about the meaning of the symbols, about the lives of those who had carved them into eternity. His grandfather answered what he could, and sometimes when his memory failed, he would smile and say that even old men must sometimes bow to mystery. At night, Amara's dreams were vivid with images his grandfather had described. He walked through grand temples that no longer existed. He saw processions of painted nobles and heard the chanting of priests. He ran his fingers along walls covered in symbols that seemed to flow like water, each one containing worlds of meaning. In these dreams, he was not the quiet farmer's boy tending vegetables in a dusty village. He was something greater, something connected to the weight and wonder of history itself. Yet when he woke, reality would settle upon him like dust. The simple reality of his small room, his family's modest circumstances, and the vast distance between a boy in a forgotten village and the grand narratives of ancient empires. He would feel the distance like a physical ache, this separation between the life he lived and the life that seemed to pulse just beyond his reach, in the stones and shadows and the endless mysteries of his homeland. His parents spoke of his future in practical terms. They hoped he might continue the farm, perhaps marry and build a family as his father had done. They were good people and they loved him deeply, but they could not understand the way history called to him, the way his soul seemed to belong to an age that had already passed. Amara had never spoken these feelings aloud. Instead, he carried them silently, nurturing them in secret on the rooftop, feeding them with his grandfather's stories and the endless questions that populated his mind. That night, as the desert wind carried the whispers of long-dead kings, Amara gazed at the ruins and wondered if he too might one day leave a mark upon history. Grandfather's voice grew thin as papyrus as he gripped Amara's shoulder beneath the sprawling acacia tree. The old man's weathered fingers trembled slightly. Whether from age or emotion, Amara could not quite tell. Around them, the village had grown quiet in the late afternoon, the heat pressing down like a heavy blanket, and the ancient stones of the nearby ruins seemed to listen to every word that passed between them. "There are things I have carried in my heart for many years," Grandfather began, his eyes distant and unfocused, as if he were peering through layers of time itself. "Things I learned during my years among the tombs and temples, before I gave up the scholar's life to raise you here in this humble place." He paused, searching Amara's face as if looking for some sign of readiness, some indication that the boy could bear the weight of what he was about to reveal. The wind stirred the leaves above them, creating shadows that danced across the old man's face. Amara leaned closer, drawn by something indefinable in his grandfather's tone, a gravity that made even the ordinary world around them feel charged with significance. "Our family," Grandfather continued, "does not come from these fields and these villages by accident, my boy. We are descended from the great ones, from those who walked in the shadow of pharaohs and served in the temples when the Nile still carried the prayers of the ancient world. Your blood is not ordinary blood. It carries memory and power and purpose that you have yet to understand." Amara felt something stir within him at these words, a sensation like distant thunder rolling across a horizon he could not quite see. He wanted to ask questions, to demand clarity, but something in his grandfather's expression silenced him. The old man continued, speaking in riddles and suggestions rather than direct statements, as if the true knowledge could only be understood through the veil of metaphor and mystery. "The old sites, they speak to those who know how to listen," Grandfather whispered, "and I have always suspected that you, Amara, you might possess ears tuned to their frequency. Watch the stones. Pay attention to what others dismiss as coincidence or imagination. There is something stirring in you, something that the ancient world has been waiting to awaken." In the days that followed this strange conversation, Amara found himself drawn repeatedly to the ruins that bordered his village. And it was there that he began to notice things that he could not adequately explain to anyone, things that made him question the boundary between reality and fancy. Once, as he walked past the broken columns of what might have once been a temple, every bird in the vicinity fell silent at precisely the same moment, as if responding to an unheard signal. Another time, when he touched an ancient cornerstone, he experienced a flash of sensation, bright and terrifying, showing him images of robed figures moving through torchlit corridors. He told no one of these experiences, not even his mother, who would surely dismiss them as the daydreams of a boy spending too much time alone among ruins. But Grandfather knew. Amara could see it in the knowing look that crossed the old man's face when they encountered each other in the village. A look that seemed to say, "Yes, it is beginning, just as I suspected." One evening, as the sun descended toward the horizon and painted the desert in shades of amber and rose, Amara ventured deeper into the ruins than he had ever dared before. He found himself in a chamber that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time, where the air felt thick and charged with presence. His hand reached out almost of its own volition, pressing against a stone wall that had stood untouched for centuries. The stone beneath Amara's palm grew warm, and for just a moment, he swore he heard the distant chanting of priests from centuries past. His mother had never spoken of such things before, and her trembling hands as she poured the tea told Amara that this moment had been long anticipated. The steam rose in delicate spirals between them as they sat in the cool shadows of their modest home, where generations of their family had lived quietly, almost invisibly, within the shadow of Cairo's ancient glory. Outside, the afternoon heat shimmered across the dusty streets of their village, but here in this space, everything felt suspended in time, weighted with centuries of unspoken words. She set the tea aside and reached for his hand, her papery skin warm and surprisingly strong. Her eyes, which had always seemed to hold distant knowledge, now burned with a clarity that made Amara lean forward, his breath catching slightly. The warmth from the stones still lingered on his palm, as though the earth itself had prepared him for this revelation. "Your ancestor," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "walked those ruins you have touched your entire life. Not as a visitor, not as a common man, but as one of the highest priests in the Temple of Ammon during the reign of Pharaoh Rameses III. His name was Kenti, and he held the secrets of the priesthood, the knowledge of the stars, the mathematics of the pyramids, and the spiritual connection between the divine and mortal realms. The family had guarded this truth through centuries of upheaval, through empires rising and falling, through the transformation of the land itself. Amara felt his throat tighten. The feeling of the stone's warmth returned, spreading through his chest, as though his blood itself recognized this ancient lineage. His mother continued, explaining how the family had deliberately chosen obscurity as protection. When dynasties fell and conquerors swept across the land, it was the humble who survived, the invisible who endured. They had lived as shepherds, as farmers, as ordinary people, allowing the weight of their heritage to settle silently in their bones rather than displayed upon their brows. She spoke of documents hidden within the walls of their home, of symbols passed down through careful instruction, of rituals observed in private that connected them to something far greater than themselves. Each generation had waited, she explained, for the one who would be ready to bear this knowledge, who would understand that such inheritance brought not pride, but profound responsibility. She had watched him throughout his childhood, seen the way he communed with the ancient stones, how his spirit seemed to recognize something that transcended the ordinary world. "Your grandfather saw it in you," she said, her voice catching slightly. "He told me before he passed that you would be the bridge between the old world and whatever comes next. He said your hands would remember what your mind had forgotten, that your heart would know the way home even when home seemed impossibly distant." The implications began to unfold within Amara's consciousness like a flower blooming in fast motion. The dreams he had experienced since childhood, the strange pull he felt toward Cairo's ruins, the inexplicable knowledge that sometimes surfaced unbidden in his mind, the way ancient hieroglyphics seemed to whisper their meaning directly to his soul. It had never been coincidence. It had been memory carried in his very cells, passed down through the unbroken chain of his bloodline. His mother rose slowly and moved toward a hidden compartment in the wall, one he had never noticed despite living his entire life in this house. She withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, its cover worn smooth by countless careful hands. "This is yours now," she said, placing it gently into his trembling hands. "The knowledge your ancestor possessed, the observations he made, the wisdom he recorded, all of it lives here. Others have kept it safe through the ages, but it has always been meant for you." As the truth settled upon his shoulders like a sacred cloak, Amara understood that his simple life in the village was merely a prologue to a far greater story. The envelope bore no return address, only his name written in elegant script that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light. Amara found it resting upon the wooden table in his modest home, placed there by the village courier who spoke of a traveler from the city who had specifically asked for it to be delivered to his hands alone. He picked it up carefully, as though the paper itself might dissolve into dust if he gripped too firmly, and his heart quickened with an inexplicable sense of recognition. The wax seal was deep crimson, stamped with a symbol he did not recognize but somehow felt in his bones. A spiral crowned with what appeared to be a lotus flower, ancient and deliberate. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting continued its elegant dance across the page, each letter formed with precision and grace. The letter was from Dr. Nasrin Khalil, a renowned curator at the prestigious Heliopolis Academy of Ancient Studies in Cairo. Yet what caused Amara to sink into the nearest chair was not the invitation itself, but the knowledge she possessed. She wrote of his grandfather's discovery of a particular artifact in 1952, one that had never been made public. She mentioned his mother's maiden name, and the village where his family had kept sacred records for generations. She referenced a birthmark behind his left ear, shaped like a crescent moon, something only his closest family members knew. The letter read like an intimate dialogue with someone who understood the hidden threads of his existence. Dr. Kahlo wrote that she had been searching for him for 3 years, ever since she had decoded certain historical documents that led her to believe a descendant of an important lineage lived somewhere in the villages surrounding Cairo. She expressed her conviction that his family possessed knowledge that bridged the worlds of ancient wisdom and modern understanding. The academy, she explained, needed someone with his particular gifts, someone who could see connections that others overlooked, someone whose bloodline carried the memory of old Egypt in ways that textbooks could never capture. She was offering him a full scholarship. More than that, she was offering him a place within a community of scholars and seekers who valued the preservation of Egypt's deepest mysteries. The academy's walls, she wrote, had stood for over a century, and within them walked the greatest minds devoted to understanding the nation's ancient heritage. She believed Amara belonged among them. The letter concluded with an intriguing challenge. She asked him to bring with him any family records or artifacts that his ancestors had preserved, no matter how insignificant they might seem. She wrote that nothing would be taken from him, only studied and documented, and that his family's contribution to human knowledge would finally be recognized and honored in the proper historical record. Amara read the letter 7 times as the afternoon light slanted through his window, casting long shadows across the packed earth floor of his home. Each reading revealed new layers of meaning, new implications about who he was and what his existence might represent beyond the simple life he had always known. That evening, he walked through the village streets as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Everything familiar suddenly seemed precious and temporary. The well where he had drawn water since childhood, the merchant stalls where he had purchased bread and dates, the mosque where calls to prayer had structured his days for as long as he could remember. All of it took on the quality of memory, as though he were already looking back at it from a great distance. He thought of his grandmother's warnings about destiny and the responsibilities that came with knowledge. He thought of his grandfather's journals, filled with sketches and observations about the land beneath the land. He understood now that those cryptic writings had been more than the musings of an old man fascinated by history. They had been a message sent forward through time, waiting for someone to receive it. That night, he gathered what few possessions he owned. He wrapped his grandfather's journals in cloth with great care. He found the small pouch containing items his mother had given him years ago, marked only with a note, "For the one who understands." Amara sealed his small wooden trunk and whispered goodbye to the only world he had ever known, ready to answer a call he didn't yet understand. The moment Amara stepped from the bus, Cairo seized him like a living thing, pulling him into its ancient, hungry embrace. The air hit him first, thick and warm and impossibly alive with 1,000 scents he had no names for. Exhaust and spices, dust and flowers, humanity pressed against humanity. His chest tightened. His village had seemed large once. Now it felt impossibly small, a whisper forgotten before it was fully spoken. The street swallowed him whole. Taxis honked in furious conversation. Vendors called out in melodic voices that seemed to argue and cajole at once. Children darted between the flowing streams of people like fish through currents. Amara stood motionless on the curb, his wooden trunk at his feet, watching the organized chaos unfold around him. Somewhere in this labyrinth lived his future. Somewhere in these ancient streets, he would discover who he was meant to become. But standing here, surrounded by millions of souls moving with purpose he didn't possess, that future felt impossibly distant. A young man with kind eyes and a faded blue shirt approached him. In accented English, he asked if Amara needed help. Through a mixture of Arabic and gestures, Amara managed to convey his need for shelter. The young man, whose name sounded like Hassan, led him through the tangled streets with the confidence of someone born to them. They moved past bookstalls and tea shops, past men playing games with worn cards, past women carrying impossible loads with grace. Amara's head spun with the sheer density of everything. Hassan brought him to a small hostel tucked between two larger buildings, easy to miss if you weren't looking. The proprietor was an elderly woman with henna'd hands who barely looked up from her small desk. Hassan negotiated quickly, his words flowing like water while Amara stood with his trunk, feeling like a child again. A key was produced. A room was indicated. Hassan disappeared back into the city, leaving Amara alone once more. The room was simple. A narrow bed with white sheets, a window overlooking a side street, a small table, a chair. It smelled of lemon oil and age. Amara set his trunk down carefully and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling slightly. The city's noise penetrated even here, muffled but present. Horns and voices and the constant, hypnotic rumble of a million conversations. As evening descended, he ventured to the window and looked out. The street below became softer as sunset turned the buildings golden. Lights flickered on in shops and homes. The chaos seemed less aggressive now, more like the natural rhythm of something vast and ancient. He thought of his village, of his mother's small house, of the silence that could stretch for hours beneath the open sky. How different this was, how overwhelming. He lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. The plaster was water-stained in patterns that almost looked like maps. He traced invisible paths across them with his eyes, trying to imagine where they might lead. His heart still raced, his mind still spinning with too many sensations, too much newness. The sounds of the city became his lullaby. Not peaceful exactly, but rhythmic, hypnotic. Footsteps above him, voices through thin walls, the distant call of the evening prayer floating across rooftops. This was Cairo. This was where he had chosen to come. This was where his journey truly began. The night deepened and the city's pace gradually slowed, though never quite stopping. Amara felt the tension in his shoulders begin to release. The windows darkened to full black. The voices became fewer, more intimate. The horns less frequent. Outside, Cairo never truly slept, but it dreamed. And in that dreaming state, a boy from a small village drifted toward his own dreams. As sleep finally claimed him, Amara dreamed of pyramids that walked on legs of sand, and voices calling his name in languages dead for millennia. The building's entrance was unmarked, hidden behind carved wooden doors that seemed to belong in a different century entirely. Amara stood before them in the early morning light, her heart quickening as the elderly man beside her withdrew an ancient bronze key from beneath his linen robes. The streets around them were still quiet, the city of Cairo not yet fully awakened to its daily rhythms. She had followed Professor Khalid here without question, trusting the instinct that had guided her since the moment she arrived at what she believed was simply an academy for gifted students. The key turned with a sound like distant thunder, and the doors swung inward to reveal a courtyard bathed in soft golden light. It was impossible. Outside these walls lay modern Cairo with its concrete and traffic and electric wires. Yet here stood something that could only belong to another Egypt entirely. Fountains bubbled peacefully in stone basins, their water catching the sunrise like scattered diamonds. Palms and date trees created islands of shade, and the air itself seemed to carry the scent of incense and ancient stone. "Welcome," Professor Khalid said softly, his weathered face breaking into a knowing smile, "to the hidden academy. We have been waiting for you for quite some time." They descended into the main hall, and Amara felt as though she were walking backward through centuries. The walls were decorated with hieroglyphic inscriptions that glowed faintly in the morning shadows, and she realized with trembling wonder that these were not reproductions or scholarly attempts at translation. They were genuine, original, somehow preserved in this impossible space. Glass cases held artifacts that should have been locked away in museums, papyri with intact colors, bronze tools that caught the light like mirrors, jewelry that seemed to pulse with its own inner radiance. This academy has existed for far longer than the modern nation of Egypt, Professor Khalid explained as they walked, his voice carrying the weight of profound knowledge. It was founded to preserve what the ancients knew, what they built their entire civilization upon. Not just the practical knowledge, though we study that too, but the deeper wisdom, the understanding of harmony, of purpose, of the invisible threads that connect all living things. Other students began to emerge as the sun climbed higher, and Amara noticed something peculiar about them. They moved with a kind of purposeful grace, and when their eyes met hers, she felt the weight of genuine recognition there, as though they had been expecting her. They were not children who played at being scholars. They carried themselves with a quiet dignity that suggested they understood something fundamental about their place in the world. We identify certain individuals, the professor continued, guiding her through corridors lined with mirrors of polished copper that reflected impossible landscapes, those who carry within them the spark of what the ancients would have recognized as kingship. Not necessarily royalty, you understand, but the capacity to lead with wisdom, to see beyond the immediate into the eternal patterns that govern existence. These individuals appear approximately once in a generation. They often come from unexpected places. They pass through chambers where students sat in meditation, others studied texts written in languages Amara did not recognize but somehow understood. Through high windows, she caught glimpses of the Cairo skyline, that modern sprawl of streets and buildings, and it seemed almost dreamlike from this vantage point, as though viewed from very far away. Your family line carries the old blood, the professor said, pausing before an enormous stone door inscribed with the Kardach of Thoth, the god of wisdom. Your grandmother knew this. She protected you, guided you, prepared you. Now you will learn what they knew, what they preserved. You will study the sciences of the ancients, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and the deeper philosophies that made them possible. You will understand your role in Egypt's true destiny, one that moves beyond politics and national borders into something far more significant. Amara's mind spun with questions, but words seemed inadequate. The building seemed to breathe around her, alive with ancient purpose. As Amara descended the stone staircase into the academy's library, he realized he was entering a world that existed outside of ordinary time. Dr. Khalil's eyes held the depth of someone who had spent a lifetime studying the infinite, and when he looked at Amara, it was as though he could see through time itself. The elderly scholar sat behind a desk of dark mahogany, its surface worn smooth by decades of thoughtful hands turning ancient pages. Candles flickered softly around the room, casting dancing shadows across shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one heavy with the weight of centuries bound in leather and cloth. Amara felt his breath slow as he crossed the threshold into this sanctum of knowledge. The air itself seemed different here, charged with something he could not quite name. Dr. Khalil rose with surprising grace for his years, extending a weathered hand in greeting. His grip was firm, reassuring, and when he smiled, the lines around his eyes deepened like the canyons of an ancient landscape. You have finally come, Doctor, Khalil said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I have been expecting you for longer than you might imagine. Please sit. Amara settled into a chair of worn velvet, watching as the old man resumed his place across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the city hummed with the evening sounds of Cairo, but here in this library beneath the academy, time seemed to hold its breath. Your journey began long before you understood it, Doctor. Khalil began, his fingers steepled thoughtfully beneath his chin. The village where you were raised, the questions that have haunted you, the dreams that visit you in the darkness. These were not accidents, Amara. They were calling you, preparing you. For what? Amara asked, though even as the words left his lips, he sensed he already knew the answer lay somewhere beyond his current understanding. For your true heritage, Doctor, Khalil replied. Your bloodline does not trace back merely to merchants and farmers, as you have been told. Within your veins flows the legacy of leaders, of guardians, of those who understood that power is not found in the accumulation of wealth or dominion over others, but in service to something greater than oneself. The scholar rose and moved to a particular shelf, his fingers trailing along the spines of books until he found what he sought. He withdrew a volume bound in deep blue leather, its pages edged in gold that caught the candlelight like captured starlight. "This is your history," he said, placing it gently before Amara. "Not the history told in conventional textbooks, but the true chronicle of your family's role in guiding this nation through its most crucial moments. You will study it, understand it, and eventually you will be called upon to honor it." As Amara opened the volume, he saw his own face staring back at him from an ancient painting. Not identical, but unmistakably connected. Generations separated by centuries, yet somehow united in the same determined expression, the same light burning in the eyes. "There will be much to learn, Doctor," Khalil continued, returning to his seat. "Philosophy, history, languages, the science of governance, the art of reading people and circumstances. You will need to understand not just the mechanics of leadership, but its soul. You must learn why certain choices were made, why certain sacrifices were deemed necessary, and how to carry the weight of responsibility without allowing it to crush the compassion in your heart." He leaned forward, and in that moment, something shifted in the space between them. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and Amara could suddenly perceive the deeper dimensions of his mentor's knowledge and concern. "Most importantly, Doctor," Khalil said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, "you must learn who you truly are beneath the name given to you at birth. Everything else, the crown, the throne, the responsibility, all of it will mean nothing if you do not understand the person who will eventually wear them." By the end of their first lesson, Amara understood that he was being prepared for something far greater than academic achievement. They gathered in the candlelit chamber as though drawn by invisible threads, each carrying the weight of secrets in their eyes. It was Karim who first suggested the meeting, a quiet word whispered between classes about a room in the academy's eastern wing where no one ventured after sunset. Amara had arrived uncertainly, following the lamplit corridors deeper into the building than ever before, each step feeling like a crossing into something sacred and necessary. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with shelves holding ancient texts and curious objects whose purposes Amara could not name. Candles flickered in holders of tarnished silver, casting dancing shadows that seemed to hold stories of their own. 4 others were already present when Amara entered, and somehow their faces were familiar not from shared classes but from something deeper, some recognition that transcended ordinary acquaintance. Karim stood by a window overlooking the nocturnal city, his silhouette sharp against the moonlit glass. Beside him was Layla, whose dark eyes held the intensity of someone who had already lived several lifetimes. There was Hassan, whose gentle hands belied the strength Amara had sensed in him during their chance encounters in the library. And Noor, whose movements were like water flowing downhill, natural and purposeful. No formal greeting was exchanged. They simply began to sit in the circle that seemed predefined by the room itself, as if the space had been waiting for them all along. Amara took a place between Hassan and Layla, feeling the subtle warmth of their presence like the comfort of a hearth after a long journey through cold streets. Karim spoke first, his voice low and deliberate. He asked each of them in turn about their villages, their families, their reasons for coming to the academy. One by one, they revealed pieces of themselves, stories that echoed with uncanny similarity. Each had been called in dreams. Each had found the letter of acceptance impossible to refuse. Each felt the pull toward something greater than themselves, something that had no name but resonated in the marrow of their bones. Layla had grown up near the Red Sea, in a place where the desert met water and ancient currents still seemed to flow through the air. Hassan came from the southern reaches, where the Nile's voice grew deeper and more mysterious. Noor had wandered from place to place, never quite settling until the letter arrived. Karim himself had lived in Cairo all his life, yet had felt like a stranger until finding this circle. As they spoke, Amara recognized something he had never fully articulated before. These were people who had always sensed the existence of invisible layers beneath ordinary reality. They were the ones who heard whispers in the wind, who dreamed in symbols, who could feel the pulse of history in stones and soil. The academy had not created this quality in them, It had simply identified what already existed. They did not discuss what they were being prepared for. That conversation remained unspoken, held in the space between their words and the flicker of candlelight. Instead, they spoke of their fears and their hopes, of the moments they had felt most alive and most lost. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their individual stories began to weave together into something unified, a pattern that was only visible when all the threads were held together. Noor reached into the center of the circle and placed her hand flat on the floor. Without hesitation, without planning, the others placed their hands upon hers. The gesture was simple but profound, a wordless covenant. Amara felt his palm touch the cool stone, felt the solid presence of 4 other souls committed to something that transcended explanation. The hours passed without measure. They did not need to plan how they would return to their chambers or worry about being discovered. Time seemed to fold differently here, as if the candlelit room existed in a space where ordinary rules held less authority. When the night grew late and they finally prepared to leave, moving reluctantly back toward the academy's main corridors, something had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer 5 separate students carrying isolated secrets. They were 5 points of a star, 5 branches of a single tree, 5 notes of an unfinished song. As they stood together in silence, Amara felt the presence of something greater than himself, something that connected them all. In the chamber of meditation, surrounded by incense that drifted like ancient prayers, Amara felt something shift deep within his consciousness. The fragrant smoke curled upward in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost sentient, as though the very air was trying to communicate something that words could never quite capture. He sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, his spine perfectly aligned, his breath moving in and out with the rhythm of the desert wind he remembered from his childhood village. Days of study had led him here, to this moment. The old texts he had discovered in the university library seemed to have called to him, their pages yellowed with centuries yet somehow fresh with meaning. He had read of his ancestors, great teachers and healers who walked these lands when the pyramids were still gleaming white against the sky. They spoke of an inner sight, a sensitivity to the currents of energy that flowed through all living things. What he had once thought myth now felt achingly real. His body felt lighter with each exhale. The weight of doubt and disbelief that he had carried for so long seemed to be dissolving like salt in water. Around him, the chamber seemed to expand, its walls becoming less distinct, less important. There was only the space between his thoughts, the fertile darkness where possibility lived. Then came a sensation he could not name. It started as a tingling at the base of his spine, a gentle awakening that moved upward through his body like water finding its way through sand. His hands began to warm, and he realized with startling clarity that he could sense the presence of the woman who had just entered the doorway. He had not heard her footsteps. He could not see her with his eyes, which remained closed. Yet he knew with absolute certainty that it was Dr. Amina, his mentor, who stood watching him from the threshold. More than that, he could feel her emotions as clearly as if they were his own. Her curiosity, her hope, her profound belief in what he might become. It cascaded through him like a revelation, and he understood in that instant that this was one of the abilities the ancient texts had described. This was intuition elevated to something far greater, a connection that transcended the ordinary senses. His breath deepened naturally, without effort. The meditation seemed to be breathing him now rather than the other way around. Colors bloomed behind his eyelids, not hallucinations, but something purer, something that felt like remembering rather than discovering. He saw symbols that he had never studied, yet somehow knew their meanings. He understood languages that his conscious mind had never learned. It was as though a door had opened in his soul, revealing chambers within chambers of knowledge that had always been waiting inside him. Time became strange and fluid. He could not tell if minutes or hours had passed. The incense continued its eternal dance, and Amara's mind expanded to encompass not just the room around him, but something far vaster. He became aware of a presence, a collective consciousness perhaps, or the unified field that ancient mystics had always spoken of. It was not frightening. It was home. It was where he came from and where he had always belonged. In this state of expanded awareness, Amara felt a surge of energy move through his entire being. It settled in his chest, in his heart, in that sacred chamber where will and compassion converge. He understood with unshakable certainty that he possessed something within him that could move mountains, that could inspire crowds, that could heal the wounded places within people's souls. It was not power for its own sake, but power in service, power as a river serves the thirsty land. Gradually, as though returning from a vast distance, Amara became aware of his body again. His hands rested peacefully on his knees. His breath had slowed to barely perceptible movements. The chamber came back into focus, the walls drawing near once more. Doctor, Amina still stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, and he knew she had witnessed something extraordinary. When he opened his eyes, the world appeared different, as though he had always seen it through a veil that had finally been lifted. The doubt crept in like dusk, silent and inevitable, whispering questions he had no answers for. Amara found himself moving through the narrow streets of Cairo without conscious intention, his feet carrying him deeper into the maze of markets and alleyways where the city's true heartbeat pulsed. The veil that had lifted in his eyes after that moment of clarity now felt like a burden rather than a gift. He could see things others could not. The hidden currents of desire in people's glances, the unspoken struggles beneath their smiles, and it exhausted him in ways he could not articulate. A vendor called out to him, holding up dates glazed with honey, their sweetness catching the amber light of hanging lanterns. Amara stopped and purchased a small handful, pressing coins into weathered hands without haggling. The vendor's eyes registered surprise at his gentleness, and Amara recognized in that moment what everyone had been telling him all along. He was different, but different from what? And toward what end? He sat on a weathered bench near the Khan el-Khalili Bazaar, watching the evening crowds thin as shop owners began their closing rituals. A mother hurried past with 3 children in tow, each holding a small toy, their laughter bright and uncomplicated. They wanted nothing more than the simple joy of going home, of rest, of belonging somewhere without question. Amara envied them with an intensity that surprised him. The words his grandmother had spoken weeks ago returned to haunt him. Destiny, crown, shepherd, they sounded like poetry when others said them, but they tasted like obligation when he whispered them to himself. What if he did not want to be a shepherd? What if the vast responsibility everyone saw crystallizing within him was not a gift, but a prison being constructed around his willing feet? He wandered toward the river, drawn by an instinct to move closer to water, closer to something that flowed without direction or purpose. The Nile stretched before him like a dark mirror, its surface catching fragments of the city's electric glow. Other people stood along the banks too, young couples holding hands, fishermen preparing their nets for night work, elderly men smoking pipes and discussing the day's news. They all seemed so certain in their existence, so rooted in the present moment. A child approached him, no more than 8 years old, with sharp eyes and sun-darkened skin. The boy held out his hand, asking for money, but there was something in his manner that felt like understanding. Amara knelt down to meet him at eye level. "Do you know what you want to be when you grow older?" Amara asked in Arabic. The child tilted his head, considering. "Strong," he said simply. "I want to be strong so my mother doesn't have to work so hard." The answer struck Amara with unexpected force. This child had not been told what he should become by whispers and prophecies. He had simply looked at the world, identified a need, and decided. There was a kind of freedom in that choice, even if the circumstances that demanded it were difficult. "You will be," Amara told him, pressing more money into small palms than he should have. As the boy ran away into the darkness, Amara sat back on his heels. The weight of the veil-lifted sight pressed down on his shoulders again. He could see so much now. The threads that connected people, the invisible responsibilities that bound communities together, the way one person's choices rippled outward like stones cast into still water. Perhaps that was the true burden, not that he might become a shepherd or a king, but that he could see exactly how much his choices would matter to others, and he could never unknow that terrible clarity. The city hummed around him as night deepened. Street musicians began their evening performances. The smell of night-blooming flowers mixed with cooking fires and urban dust. Cairo was alive with thousands of small stories, thousands of people making choices moment by moment, most of them never knowing how their decisions affected the vast web of existence around them. Standing alone on the Nile's bank, watching the city lights reflect upon the water, Amara wondered if destiny was something you chose or something that chose you. The narrow streets smelled of life in its rawest form, struggle and hope intertwined like the threads of an ancient tapestry. Amara walked slowly through the Al Sayeda Zainab district, his academy robes deliberately left behind in exchange for simple cotton clothes that allowed him to blend into the fabric of these neighborhoods. The academy's instruction had been clear: spend 3 weeks serving those in greatest need, without status or privilege, without the shield of his lineage or education. His first morning began in a cramped clinic where Dr. Layla, a woman with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that held infinite patience, showed him how to clean wounds with care and dignity. There was an elderly man whose foot had become infected, a young mother with 2 children clinging to her skirts seeking medicine she could not afford, a teenager whose accident at a construction site had left him uncertain about his future. Amara learned their names first before their ailments. He listened as they spoke of their lives, their fears, their small victories that outsiders might never notice. Days passed in gentle rhythm. Amara helped distribute food at a community center, where he learned that feeding someone was never merely about the meal itself. It was about seeing them, acknowledging their worth in a world that often rendered the poor invisible. An older woman named Fatima showed him how to serve with grace, how to smile in a way that communicated respect rather than pity. She had lost everything in a flood years ago, she explained, yet she returned each day to help others rebuild. He assisted at a small school operating in a converted warehouse, where children sat on mismatched chairs and teachers improvised lessons with whatever materials they could gather. The curiosity in those young eyes, the hunger for knowledge that transcended their material poverty, awakened something in Amara. He read stories aloud, watched children's faces transform as they traveled to distant lands through words alone. One girl, perhaps 8 years old, asked him if he believed she could become anything she dreamed. The weight of that question, the responsibility it carried, stayed with him long after he left the classroom. In the evenings, Amara found himself in quiet conversations with people whose circumstances had initially seemed foreign to him. A shopkeeper spoke of the balance he sought between providing for his family and maintaining his integrity in a system that sometimes demanded compromise. A widow described the loneliness of loss, but also the unexpected strength she discovered in her grief. Each person carried within them a complexity that no summary could capture, a depth of character that poverty could not diminish. Gradually, Amara noticed something shifting within himself. The philosophical question that had troubled him on the Nile's bank began to transform. Watching a young boy help his mother carry water despite his obvious fatigue, seeing a community come together to repair a neighbor's damaged home, observing Dr. Layla work through the night to help someone in crisis, he began to understand that destiny was neither purely chosen nor purely imposed. It was discovered through engagement with the world and its people, through the choices made in response to what you witnessed and understood. One afternoon, as he helped distribute blankets before the evening chill arrived, an elderly woman struggled to walk. Her joints were stiff, her breathing labored. Amara offered his arm, and together they moved slowly through the narrow streets. She told him about her grandchildren, about the hopes she held for them despite her exhaustion. She spoke with such tenderness about people she loved that her poverty seemed almost irrelevant to the fullness of her life's meaning. She asked him nothing about his background, his education, his future ambitions. She simply shared her presence, and somehow that felt like the greatest lesson of all. When they reached her modest home, she pressed his hand between both of hers, and in that moment of contact, something became clear to him. Leadership was not about position or power or inherited destiny. It was about capacity. The capacity to understand suffering, to respond to it with genuine compassion, and to commit oneself to alleviating it wherever possible. As Amara helped an elderly woman to her door, he felt something crystallize within him. Purpose not imposed but genuinely chosen. The city thrummed with dissatisfaction, a low frequency that everyone felt but few could name. Cairo had changed in the weeks since Amara last walked its crowded streets with fresh eyes. The newspapers spoke in careful language about economic frustration and calls for reform. The cafes buzzed with conversations that grew hushed when strangers approached. Even the air itself seemed to carry an electric charge, as though the very stones of the ancient city were remembering their own revolutions. Amara noticed it most acutely during his evening walks through the neighborhoods where he had grown roots. The vendors at the market spoke differently now, their voices edged with something between hope and anxiety. Mothers gathered in doorways, watching their children with the particular wariness of those who sense change approaching. He had chosen purpose in helping others, in genuinely serving his community, yet he could not ignore what was happening around him. The undercurrent of change was becoming a current, and he found himself caught within its flow. Dr. Khalil summoned him to the academy on an evening when the city's tension seemed almost visible, like humidity before a storm. The old scholar's office felt different than before, the shadows deeper, the books somehow more deliberate in their arrangement. Khalil sat behind his desk with an expression that suggested he had been waiting not just for Amara, but for this particular moment in history itself. "You have served the people well," the doctor began, his voice measured and deliberate. "Your work in the neighborhoods has not gone unnoticed. More importantly, the seeds you have planted have taken root in ways that extend far beyond individual acts of kindness." Amara felt uncertainty bloom in his chest. "I do not understand, doctor. I am simply helping where help is needed." Khalil rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the city lights below. "The academy has been many things over many generations. A repository of knowledge, certainly. A shelter for those who seek understanding. But we are also something more deliberate than that. We have long understood that nations, like gardens, require careful tending. The right person in the right place at the right time can reshape the course of history itself." "Doctor, you are speaking in riddles." "No," Khalil turned to face him. "I am speaking in truth, perhaps for the first time so clearly. Cairo is awakening. The people are beginning to question what they have accepted for too long. This dissatisfaction, this hunger for change, it has been carefully cultivated over years. We identified it, understood it, and positioned individuals throughout the city to guide it toward constructive ends rather than destructive chaos." Amara's mind raced. "You are telling me the academy orchestrated this unrest?" "Orchestrated is too crude a word. We recognized what was inevitable and shaped its direction, and we have prepared someone to lead when the moment of transition arrives. Someone who understands both the ancient wisdom and the modern struggles of this nation. Someone whose roots lie in the villages but whose heart has expanded to embrace the capital. Someone who knows how to serve before seeking to lead." The weight of understanding settled upon Amara like a physical thing. His work in the neighborhoods, his studies, his careful cultivation of influence and trust, it had all been part of a much larger design. Yet even as he grasped the scope of what Khalil was suggesting, he recognized something else. His choice to serve authentically had not been manufactured. That had been real, genuinely his own, born from the crystallization of purpose he had felt guiding the elderly woman to her door. "Why are you telling me this now?" Amara asked quietly. "Because," Khalil said, returning to his desk, "the moment is approaching when you must choose with full knowledge. The academy does not conscript its leaders, We reveal to them what they might become, and they must decide if they wish to answer that calling. Egypt needs what you have become, Amara. A man equally at home in the poorest quarters and the most refined halls. A leader who understands that true power lies in service, not domination. Outside, Cairo continued its restless stirring, waiting for something it could not yet name. Amara stood in that office, suspended between worlds, between the man he had been and the man he might yet become. The responsibility felt immense, terrifying, and somehow inevitable. Dr. Khalil's final words that evening echoed in Amara's mind. The throne awaits one who is worthy to sit upon it, and Egypt is beginning to remember what it means to have a true leader. The gallery opening was designed as a stage, with every light angled to illuminate not the art, but the people within its walls. Amara stood near the entrance of the contemporary art space in downtown Cairo, watching the careful choreography of Cairo's elite as they moved through the white-walled rooms. He wore a simple linen shirt, cream-colored, which somehow made him appear more present than those draped in designer fabrics. Dr. Khalil had orchestrated this invitation with the precision of someone accustomed to moving invisible threads. The paintings themselves seemed almost incidental to the evening's true purpose. Abstract works in bold colors lined the walls, yet the gallery's polished floors reflected faces more than images. Amara felt the weight of observation before he felt the approach of any individual. People sensed him the way animals sense weather changes, a shift in atmospheric pressure that makes them pause and take notice. A woman in a tailored black dress approached first. She introduced herself as Layla, an influential journalist whose weekly column shaped opinions across the country. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, but they softened as she spoke with Amara. She asked about his background, his observations of Cairo, his thoughts on tradition and progress. He answered with the same measured thoughtfulness he brought to everything, speaking not with the urgency of someone trying to impress, but with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing to prove. Within minutes, others began to congregate. A businessman who owned several development companies, a university professor of philosophy, an artist whose work hung on the walls before them. They came not because anyone had directed them to Amara, but because they sensed something worth understanding. His words seemed to hold weight in a city accustomed to hollow rhetoric. When he spoke about the balance between honoring Egypt's ancient wisdom and embracing necessary change, listeners found themselves nodding as though recognizing a truth they had always known. The photographer arrived around 9 o'clock, sent by one of Cairo's major newspapers. She captured him in conversation with the businessman, his face turned slightly toward the light, his expression containing both gravitas and gentleness. The image would appear in tomorrow's edition, carefully cropped to show Amara as part of this elevated circle, yet somehow distinct from it. He did not pose or adjust himself for the camera. There was no calculation in his bearing, which made him all the more compelling to photograph. An older man, introduced as a prominent politician with connections to ministerial circles, spent nearly 40 minutes in conversation with Amara. They discussed water management in the Nile Delta, agricultural reform, the delicate balance required in governance. The politician listened more than he spoke, a reversal of his usual pattern. Before departing, he pressed his card into Amara's palm with both hands, a gesture of respect rarely offered to those outside his established network. As the evening progressed, the gallery began to feel less like a venue for art and more like the anteroom of something significant. Amara moved through the space with unhurried grace, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. He accepted a glass of wine from a server, held it without drinking, and allowed conversations to find him rather than pursuing them. His presence seemed to create a gentle stillness wherever he stood, a pause in the constant noise that characterized Cairo's social scene. The artist whose work was being exhibited approached him near the end of the evening. She was visibly moved by something Amara had said during a conversation she had overheard. She told him that his understanding of the connection between ancient symbolism and contemporary human struggle had clarified something she had been trying to express in her work for years. He listened with complete attention, truly hearing her words rather than merely waiting for his turn to speak. By 11 o'clock, the crowd had begun to thin. Amara stood once more near the entrance, where he had begun his evening. The photographer was packing her equipment. Layla was exchanging contact information with colleagues. The businessman and politician had already departed, each having secured promises of further meetings with Amara. The gallery's pristine floors reflected the diminishing lights as the evening wound toward its close. By the evening's end, Amara had been photographed, interviewed, and had become, whether he intended it or not, a figure of interest to the city. Coincidence is merely the universe's way of remaining anonymous, or so Dr. Khalil had once said, but Amara was beginning to understand that what was happening was far more deliberate. The morning after his interview had brought something extraordinary. Archaeologists working near the edge of the village, in the exact location where Amara often walked during his contemplative hours, had uncovered a limestone fragment bearing ancient hieroglyphics. The timing felt impossible, yet the workers insisted they had only begun their survey the day before. The fragment depicted a shepherd's crook intertwined with symbols of divine kingship, and the local museum director had sent word requesting Amara's presence at the excavation site. When he arrived, the air felt different, heavy. The sky above Cairo seemed to pulse with an expectant silence, as though the entire city held its breath. The archaeologist stepped aside as he approached the partially exposed stone, and for a moment, nobody spoke. The symbols seemed to glow in the afternoon light, their meaning residing just beyond the threshold of understanding. A photographer from the national press captured the image of Amara standing before the artifact, his expression one of quiet recognition, and the photograph would later appear in newspapers across 3 countries. That evening, something stranger still occurred. Amara had decided to walk through one of the older quarters of Cairo, seeking solitude among the winding streets and ancient walls. But solitude found him impossible. A small group of university students recognized him first. They approached shyly, speaking of the interview they had seen, of words that had resonated deeply within them. As he spoke with them, others gathered. An elderly woman with kind eyes, a shopkeeper closing his stall, a child holding his mother's hand. Within 30 minutes, a crowd of nearly 200 people had assembled, drawn by something they could not quite name, held by his presence as though by an invisible current. He had not prepared remarks. He had not intended to speak at all. Yet words emerged from somewhere deeper than thought. Words about transformation and belonging, about the sacred duty each person carries to become their truest self. A journalist who happened to be passing through the quarter documented the spontaneous gathering, and by morning, the images were circulating through social media with captions proclaiming "The Shepherd Speaks" and "A Voice for the Voiceless." The hashtags proliferated exponentially. 3 major news outlets had now requested formal interviews. An intellectual who had long advocated for cultural renewal had published an essay comparing certain phrases from Amara's impromptu address to ancient philosophical traditions, suggesting connections that seemed too precise to be coincidental. A prominent filmmaker had begun preliminary discussions about documenting his journey. And strangest of all, a collection of ancient texts had surfaced in a private archive, texts that contained passages eerily similar to things Amara had spoken aloud, things he had no knowledge of before saying them. The rational mind rebels against such synchronicity. The educated mind seeks explanation and pattern. Yet Amara found himself suspended between belief and bewilderment, aware that something was orchestrating itself through him and around him, something that transcended the merely coincidental. His grandmother had spoken of such times, of moments when destiny crystallized into visible form, when the spiritual architecture of the world became briefly apparent to those with eyes to see it. In his small room at night, he would lie awake and consider the impossible mathematics of it all. What force, if force existed, could arrange such convergences? What intelligence could weave together strands so precisely? The symbols that had always called to him from the ancient walls now seemed to be calling back, acknowledging his presence, affirming something he barely dared name. His reflection in the mirror began to seem unfamiliar, as though he was becoming someone larger than the boy who had tended sheep in the village, someone whose outline was being drawn by forces both internal and external. The media continued its ceaseless documentation. The crowds grew where he walked. The artifacts kept surfacing, and Amara, caught between confusion and strange clarity, moved forward through it all as though reading from a script written long before his birth. The symbols were aligning, and Amara could feel the machinery of destiny grinding steadily forward, with him at its center. The phone calls came at all hours now, urgent voices asking him to do things, to be things, to lead things. Amara would wake in the darkness of his modest apartment, the buzzing of his phone cutting through whatever fragile dreams had claimed him, and he would lie there for a moment, gathering the strength to answer. Each call was the same and yet different. A journalist wanting a statement, a protest organizer seeking his endorsement, a government official requesting a private meeting. The weight of expectation had grown so heavy that sometimes he could barely breathe under its pressure. Outside his window, the city had transformed. The streets that once carried the ordinary rhythms of daily life now thrummed with electric tension. Crowds gathered at intersections, their voices rising and falling like waves against stone. The regime that had governed with such certainty just months before now seemed to fracture from within, its leadership making desperate decisions that only intensified the public's anger. Amara watched the news reports with a strange detachment, seeing his own name appear more frequently, his image broadcast beside those of ministers and generals who were suddenly scrambling to maintain control. His mentor at the academy had warned him about this. They had sat together in the library, surrounded by ancient texts and modern analyses, and the old scholar had spoken with the weariness of someone who had witnessed such cycles before. Power seeks those who do not hunger for it, the mentor had said, and now the machinery of that power was turning toward Amara, inexorably, like some vast wheel that would crush him if he stood in its path or elevate him if he rode upon it. The choice he had thought then was still his own. Now he was not so certain. The protests had grown larger with each passing week. Amara had ventured into the crowds once, moving through them anonymously, listening to what people said about the future, about hope, about change. They spoke of him even then, these strangers who knew his name but not his face. The shepherd boy from the village had become a symbol, whether he had chosen it or not. They projected onto him their dreams and their desperation, their need to believe that someone might come who could guide them through the darkness gathering around the nation. The government's response had become increasingly erratic. Security forces clashed with demonstrators. Internet connections were intermittently severed. The official media outlets published contradictory statements that seemed designed to sow confusion rather than clarity. Something was breaking in the machinery of state, and Amara could feel it the way one might feel an earthquake beginning, that subtle tremor that precedes the violent shaking. His closest advisors at the academy had begun speaking more openly about inevitability. They meant well, these men and women who had guided his education, who had recognized something in him worth cultivating. Yet their words felt like chains woven from silk and intellectual argument. They spoke of his responsibility to his people, of the moment in history that demanded action, of how his silence now might be interpreted as complicity. The pressure mounted from every direction, gentle and relentless. Amara had spent his evening walking the corridors of the academy, passing through rooms lined with scrolls and manuscripts, through gardens where night-blooming flowers released their fragrance into the cooling air. He had sought solace in these familiar spaces, but even here, he could not escape the awareness that things were reaching a crescendo. The calm he had cultivated through years of study and reflection seemed increasingly impossible to maintain. The world outside was demanding something from him, and it would not be satisfied with meditation or contemplation or careful deliberation. As he climbed the spiral staircase to the academy's highest tower, his footsteps echoed in the silence. The weight of unsaid things pressed against his chest. When he reached the top and looked out at the sprawling expanse of the city below, he saw it differently now. The light seemed dimmer in some quarters, brighter in others where crowds still gathered. The future stretched before him, uncertain and demanding, and he understood with crystalline clarity that he stood at a threshold beyond which everything would change. As Amara looked out at the city from the academy's highest tower, he realized that the time for quiet contemplation had passed, and action could no longer be delayed. The council chamber was silent except for the sound of ancient water clocks ticking in forgotten corners, as if time itself was holding its breath. Amara stood before the assembled faces, each one weathered by years of guardianship over the nation's cultural and intellectual legacy. Candlelight danced across the stone walls, casting shadows that seemed to pulse with the weight of centuries. The Academy's chancellor, an elderly woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held infinite wisdom, rose slowly from her seat. Her movement commanded attention without demanding it. Around the circular table sat others, some Amara recognized from his studies, others who had journeyed specifically for this moment. Among them were merchants whose family lines traced back to the pharaohs, scholars who had deciphered forgotten texts, and community leaders from villages scattered across the nation. Amara, the chancellor began, her voice gentle yet purposeful. We have watched you transform. The boy who arrived at our gates uncertain and searching has become something more. You have studied our history not merely as academic pursuit, but as spiritual journey. You have walked among the people and heard their struggles. You have contemplated our future in solitude and emerged with clarity. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Amara felt his heart quickening. Though he attempted to maintain the composure he had cultivated over months of meditation and discipline. The nation stands at a crossroads, continued a merchant from the east, his voice carrying the accent of the desert. Our people are eager for leadership that understands both tradition and progress. They seek someone who emerged from their own soil, who shares their struggles, yet possesses the wisdom to guide them forward. A scholar leaned forward, her eyes intense with conviction. We do not ask this lightly. The burden you would carry is immense, yet we believe you are capable of bearing it. The question before us now is whether you are willing. Amara's throat tightened. In the weeks following his tower vigil, he had wrestled with this inevitable moment. He had walked the narrow streets of the village where he was born, reconnecting with the simplicity he had once known. He had sat by the Nile's edge, watching the current flow inexorably toward the sea, understanding finally that some forces cannot be resisted but only channeled with wisdom and grace. He thought of his grandmother, whose stories had ignited his imagination and set him upon this path. He thought of the countless faces in markets and squares, people who carried their own dreams and fears. He considered the quiet life he might have led, the peace of anonymity, the freedom from the expectations that would crush a lesser spirit. Yet he also understood something profound that had crystallized during his solitude. Destiny was not a burden imposed from without, but rather a calling that resonated from within. The question was not whether he would be forced into leadership, but whether he would freely choose to answer the call that his own spirit had already acknowledged. The chancellor watched him with patient understanding, as if she could see the internal struggle playing across his features. The ticking of the water clock seemed to grow louder, marking moments that stretched like hours. Amara closed his eyes briefly, drawing upon the teachings he had absorbed in this very academy. He thought of the ancient rulers who had faced similar moments of decision, balancing personal desire against collective need. He understood now that true leadership did not require the abandonment of self, but rather the expansion of self to encompass something greater. When he opened his eyes, his vision was clear. Fear remained, certainly, and humility before the magnitude of what lay ahead. But underneath ran a current of resolve, like stone beneath shifting sand, immovable and eternal. He took a breath that seemed to draw in the accumulated wisdom of the chamber itself. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the chancellor, then at each council member in turn. Amara's voice was steady as he spoke the words that would irrevocably alter the course of his life and the fate of the nation. I will serve. The campaign was like watching a river redirect itself, natural and unstoppable, flowing toward a destination it had always known. Amara moved through the streets of Cairo with a presence that seemed to part crowds without effort, as if people instinctively recognized something they had been waiting for. The electricity that had sparked during his initial speech had not dimmed, but rather intensified, spreading through neighborhoods and villages like light breaking through long shadows. His team grew almost overnight, assembled not from the traditional corridors of power but from ordinary Egyptians who had heard him speak. Teachers and engineers, merchants and students, they gathered around him with a fervor that transcended politics. They saw in him not a politician seeking advancement, but a vessel for something larger than any individual ambition. The polling numbers climbed with remarkable speed, defying the conventional wisdom that suggested an outsider could never gain such traction. Amara campaigned not in the marble halls where power traditionally traded hands, but in the places where people lived their daily struggles. He stood in markets where vendors counted their coins carefully, in schools where children sat three to a desk, in hospitals where the waiting rooms overflowed with the patient and the desperate. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried the weight of genuine understanding. He had lived their lives. He knew their mathematics of survival. The established political figures watched with a mixture of fascination and concern. Some dismissed him as a temporary phenomenon, certain that voters would eventually return to familiar names and established structures. Others sensed something different in the air, a hunger in the nation that their old promises could no longer satisfy. The media coverage intensified, cameras following him from dawn until late into the evening as he moved through the city like a man possessed by purpose. His speeches evolved without losing their essential character. He spoke of infrastructure and education, of economic opportunity for those who had been left behind. But beneath every policy proposal lay something more profound, a vision of Egypt recognizing itself, of ordinary people understanding their own power to shape their future. The words resonated in ways that surprised even him, as though he was channeling something that existed already in the hearts of those who heard him. The night the elections were officially called, Amara sat alone on a rooftop overlooking Cairo. The city sprawled before him, millions of lights creating a galaxy of human habitation. He thought of the shepherd boy who had tended animals beneath the desert sky, who had gazed at the monuments of ancient power, and wondered about the forces that moved the world. That boy seemed impossibly distant now, yet he was also closer than ever, present in every decision Amara made. The final weeks of the campaign became a blur of motion and meaning. Rallies drew crowds that swelled beyond capacity, people standing shoulder to shoulder, faces illuminated by hope. The momentum was palpable, almost physical in its presence. Opponents launched attacks that seemed to slide off him without sticking. When they questioned his experience, he responded not with defensiveness, but with clarity about what experience truly meant. When they challenged his vision, he articulated it with such conviction that doubt seemed almost impossible. On the day before the election, Amara returned to the small village where his journey had truly begun. He walked the familiar paths, greeted people who had known him as a child. In the evening, he stood at the edge of the village and looked back toward Cairo, toward the future that was about to become the present. An old woman approached him, someone who had known his family, and she took his hand without speaking. Words were unnecessary. Everything had been said already. Election night arrived with a weight of significance that seemed to press upon the entire nation. As results came in, as districts reported and numbers accumulated, the pattern became unmistakable. Amara had won by a margin that stunned even his most optimistic supporters. The news spread through the city like a wave of pure light, people emerging into the streets, tears streaming down faces, embracing strangers, singing. On election night, as the results confirmed what many had begun to believe, Amara understood that the boy from the village had become something far larger than himself. The morning of his inauguration, Amara woke to the sound of the azan echoing across Cairo, and he knew that something sacred was about to unfold. The call to prayer drifted through the open windows of the residence where he had spent the night in quiet contemplation, its familiar melody carrying him back across all the years and all the distance he had traveled. He lay still for a moment, listening to the voice of the muezzin rise and fall with the ancient rhythm that had called millions to prayer across these lands for more than 14 centuries. The sound felt like a blessing, like the universe itself was acknowledging the significance of this day. Outside, Cairo was already stirring. The city had taken on a different character in recent weeks, one of anticipation and spiritual renewal. Streets that once hummed with the ordinary rhythms of commerce now thrummed with something deeper, something that spoke to the collective consciousness of a nation awakening to new possibilities. Amara rose from his bed and moved to the window, looking out across the sprawling metropolis that glowed in the early morning light. Somewhere in the distance, he could see the ancient mosques with their minarets reaching toward heaven, and beyond them, the shadowy outlines of the pyramids that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations for millennia. He dressed slowly and deliberately, each movement a meditation. The robes he wore had been specially crafted for this occasion, woven with threads that held meaning from every region of Egypt. Egyptian cotton from the Nile Delta, linen dyed with natural colors that echoed the earth tones of the desert, and subtle gold embroidery that referenced the golden dynasties of ancient times. As he fastened each button, adjusted each fold, he felt the weight of history settling upon his shoulders like a mantle he had been destined to wear all along. The ceremony itself would blend the modern and the timeless in ways that felt revolutionary yet inevitable. There would be constitutional oaths spoken in the language of contemporary governance, but these would be framed within a setting that honored the spiritual foundations upon which leadership had always rested in this ancient land. The parliament would convene in a newly redesigned chamber that incorporated architectural elements from the temples that had once dotted the Nile Valley. Light would stream through windows shaped like the lotus flowers that had symbolized rebirth and renewal since the time of the pharaohs. As Amara descended the grand staircase of the residence, his advisors and ceremonial attendants moved into position around him. He could see in their eyes the same sense of historical moment that he carried in his own heart. These were not merely political figures going through procedural motions. These were people who understood that something was being born anew in Egypt, something that honored the past while reaching toward a different future. The journey to the parliament took him through streets lined with citizens who had gathered since dawn. They stood in respectful silence, not cheering or shouting, but present in a way that felt sacred. Some held flowers, some held candles despite the morning hour. Some simply placed their hands over their hearts as he passed. Amara understood that he moved not just as an individual, but as a vessel for the hopes and dreams of millions, as a symbol of what their nation could become when it honored both its ancient wisdom and its modern aspirations. The ceremony itself unfolded like a carefully choreographed symphony. Words were spoken that bound him to his duty, that made his commitment to serve his people a formal and eternal contract. But beyond the words, it was the atmosphere that transformed the moment into something transcendent. Musicians played instruments that dated back centuries. Prayers were offered by spiritual leaders from different traditions across Egypt, each adding their blessing to the proceedings. The air itself seemed to shimmer with significance, heavy with meaning that could not quite be captured in language. And then came the moment when the ceremonial vestments were placed upon him, when symbols of office and responsibility were transferred from the old guard to his keeping. As the crown, symbolic rather than literal but weighted with centuries of history, was placed upon his head, Amara felt the presence of all those who had come before, standing with him in that eternal moment. The weight of the nation pressed upon his shoulders like the stone of 1,000 pyramids, and Amara often found himself waking in the night, unsure if he was equal to the task. In those dark hours, he would rise from his bed in the palace chambers and walk the halls, his footsteps echoing through corridors lined with portraits of leaders who had faced their own impossible trials. The marble beneath his feet was cool and unyielding, much like the decisions that awaited him each dawn. He had left behind the simplicity of his village, the rhythmic days of tending sheep beneath endless skies, and now he found himself tending to a nation of millions whose faces he would never know, whose hopes and fears rested upon choices he must make with insufficient information and inadequate certainty. The first weeks had been a blur of briefings and meetings. Economic advisors spoke of deficits and growth projections in numbers so large they seemed abstract, almost meaningless. Military generals discussed security concerns that kept their voices low and their expressions grave. Ministers of agriculture brought reports of water scarcity and failing harvests. Each problem demanded immediate solutions, yet each solution created ripples that affected dozens of other challenges. It was like trying to balance impossibly many stones, knowing that the slightest miscalculation would send them all tumbling down. Amara sat alone in the council chamber as midnight approached, reading through stacks of documents by lamplight. His eyes burned with fatigue, but sleep had become something he feared rather than sought. In sleep, he could not help anyone. In sleep, decisions remained unmade and crises unaddressed. He found himself questioning everything, wondering if his ascent had been a mistake, if the people who had placed faith in him had somehow misunderstood his capabilities. He was still learning, still reaching back through memory to the teachings his grandmother had whispered to him when he was a boy, still searching for the wisdom that might guide him through these treacherous straits. Yet there were moments, brief and precious, when he felt the presence of those who had believed in him, who had seen something within him that he could not yet see in himself. The village elder who had first encouraged him toward Cairo, his grandmother's voice carried on the wind, the memory of his mother's steady gaze. These anchors held him when doubt threatened to sweep him away entirely. He began to understand that the burden of the throne was not meant to be borne by certainty or confidence. It was meant to be borne by those willing to carry it despite their doubts, despite their fear, despite the constant whispering voice that questioned whether they were adequate to the task. Leadership, he discovered, was not about having all the answers. It was about being willing to ask the right questions, to listen to wise counsel, and then to make decisions with the full knowledge that some would suffer regardless of what path he chose. In the second week, he began to delegate more consciously, not from weakness but from clarity. He surrounded himself with experienced minds and learned to trust their expertise while maintaining his own vision for where the nation should go. He instituted morning walks through different quarters of Cairo, speaking with ordinary citizens, listening to their voices, letting their stories inform his understanding. He discovered that the weight became slightly more bearable when it was shared, when he stopped trying to carry everything alone. There were still nights when he woke uncertain, still moments when the magnitude of his responsibility seemed designed to crush him. But gradually, he began to find a rhythm, a way of moving through the days that honored both the seriousness of his position and his own human limitations. He learned that strength was not the absence of doubt, but the choice to move forward despite it. Yet each morning, as the sun rose over Cairo, Amara would return to his purpose, knowing that doubt was not a luxury he could afford. The first decree was not about power or control, but about restoration, rebuilding the systems that sustained the people. Amara sat in the marble halls of government with papers spread before him, each one representing months of careful research and collaboration with advisors who had come to understand his vision. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the documents that would reshape the nation. His first act was to allocate unprecedented funds to rural education. Schools in villages like the one from which he had emerged would receive new libraries, trained teachers, and technology that had previously seemed like luxuries reserved for Cairo's elite districts. When his ministers questioned the expense, Amara simply reminded them of a boy who learned to read by candlelight, whose hunger for knowledge had transformed his entire existence. That same hunger existed in thousands of other young minds, waiting only for opportunity. The second initiative focused on the Nile itself. Amara established the Environmental Restoration Commission, tasking them with healing the waterway that had sustained civilization for millennia. Pollution controls were implemented at factories. Agricultural practices were revised to prevent soil degradation. Young people were employed to plant native vegetation along riverbanks, creating jobs while restoring the ecosystem. When wealthy industrialists protested the regulations, Amara met with them personally, explaining that short-term profits meant nothing if the very source of life was poisoned. His third decree surprised everyone. He created an economic justice initiative that provided microloans and business training to women in impoverished communities. He had witnessed his own mother's struggles, her resourcefulness constrained by lack of capital and opportunity. Now, thousands of women received support to start their own enterprises, textile workshops, agricultural cooperatives, small trading businesses. Within weeks, reports came back of women earning income, gaining independence, and investing in their children's futures. The critics were swift and vocal. Wealthy elites complained about taxation increases to fund these programs. Religious conservatives questioned whether change moved too quickly. Political opponents suggested that Amara was reckless, idealistic, naive. Yet something remarkable began to happen. In the villages, children arrived at newly opened schools with eagerness lighting their eyes. Along the Nile, the water grew clearer as restoration efforts took hold. In neighborhoods that had known only poverty, women opened shops and hired neighbors, creating chains of opportunity that rippled through entire communities. Amara worked 18-hour days reviewing progress reports, meeting with communities, listening to concerns, and adjusting strategies when evidence suggested different approaches. He was not infallible. Some initiatives stumbled, required revision, occasionally failed entirely. But rather than hide these failures, Amara acknowledged them publicly and recalibrated. This honesty earned him credibility even among skeptics. Here was a leader who admitted mistakes and learned from them. One evening, as he stood on a balcony overlooking Cairo, his chief advisor approached with a surprising report. Opposition voices were quieting not because they agreed with every policy, but because they could see genuine improvement in people's lives. Hospitals were less crowded because health education prevented preventable illness. Streets were safer because youth had purpose and employment. Families were more stable because economic stress was easing. What Amara understood, and what set him apart from previous leaders, was that real power lay in service. Every decree, every initiative, every late night spent analyzing data, these were acts of devotion to something larger than himself. He was not leading a nation through ego or ambition. He was stewarding a people toward their own potential. By month 3 of his tenure, the transformation was visible in countless ways. Tourism flourished as environmental improvements made Cairo more beautiful. International investment increased as stability grew. Most importantly, in villages and neighborhoods throughout the nation, people spoke differently about their future. They used words like possibility, hope, and potential. Amara remained humble through it all, remembering the shepherd boy he had been, the person shaped by sand and struggle. As word spread of these changes, the people began to see in Amara's leadership the reflection of something eternal, something that transcended politics and touched the realm of the sacred. The dusty road that had carried him away from his village now received him back, transformed and transformed by the journey. Amara sat in the rear of the motorcade, watching through tinted windows as familiar landscapes unfolded before him. The palms that had sheltered his childhood seemed taller now, or perhaps he had simply forgotten their true proportions during his years in the sprawling capital. The air carried the same mineral sweetness he remembered, that particular perfume of sun-warmed earth and distant water that had once defined the entire geography of his world. The village gathered before him like a memory made manifest. Women in indigo cloth stood with children balanced on their hips, their hands raised in welcome and blessing. The men arranged themselves with quiet dignity, their weathered faces reflecting decades of tending crops and honoring tradition. As Amara descended from the vehicle, he felt the weight of his position settled differently here, as though the responsibility he carried had been lightened by the very ground beneath his feet. His mother emerged from the old house, the same structure where he had learned to read by lamplight, where he had first heard stories of pharaohs and kingdoms that stretched beyond the horizon of his village. She was smaller than he remembered, her shoulders curved like a question mark. But when she embraced him, her strength was undeniable, flowing through her weathered arms like water through ancient channels. His sisters flanked her, their eyes bright with tears they refused to shed in public, maintaining the composure that had always been their inheritance. They walked together through the village, a procession both ceremonial and intimate. Amara stopped at the schoolhouse where old teacher Hassan still conducted his lessons, the chalkboard still bearing equations that would lead young minds toward possibility. The old man bowed, and Amara lifted him into an embrace that held within it all the gratitude of a boy who had been given wings. Hassan wept openly then, his tears falling onto the dust as though watering seeds for another generation. As evening approached, Amara made his way alone to the ancient ruins that had shaped his imagination and his purpose. The stones seemed to hum with accumulated history, their weathered surfaces catching the last light of day in shades of amber and rose. He moved between them slowly, running his palm across carved hieroglyphs that his younger self had traced countless times, trying to unlock their secrets through touch alone. His family found him there as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and gold. His mother brought water and bread, the simplest sustenance, though guards now positioned themselves discreetly in the shadows. His sisters sat beside him on a stone that had endured for millennia, their presence a continuation of the comfort they had offered since childhood. Amara looked at his mother's face, weathered by years of sun and labor, lined with worry and pride in equal measure. He thought of the boy who had left this place with nothing but hunger in his belly and questions in his heart. That boy had walked through the chaos of Cairo's streets, had learned the intricate dance of power and responsibility, had been molded by circumstance into a leader whom an entire nation now followed. Yet somehow, sitting here with his family among these ancient stones, he felt as though he had merely traveled in a circle, returning to the point from which all his becoming had begun. The stones surrounding them seemed to breathe with understanding. They had witnessed countless transformations, countless lives lived and concluded, countless moments when individuals discovered their destiny encoded in the dust and stone of this timeless place. Amara realized that his journey had not been an escape from this village, but rather a fulfillment of something that had always lived within its borders. The stars emerged one by one above them, the same stars that had guided travelers and dreamers since the beginning of time. His mother's hand found his in the gathering darkness, and he held it with the reverence it deserved. Standing before the ancient stones with his family beside him, Amara understood that he had never truly left, and that his journey had always been written into the very foundations of this sacred place. The Egypt of today was becoming something new, something that honored its past while embracing a different kind of future. Amara stood in the newly constructed Hall of Memory, a building that rose from the ground near the ancient ruins not far from where his village still stood. Its walls were embedded with limestone from the desert where he had once walked barefoot as a shepherd boy, and its corridors were lined with scrolls and manuscripts, carefully preserved texts that told the stories of pharaohs and priests, scholars and ordinary people who had shaped this land across millennia. His first year in office had moved with the quiet momentum of water finding its course, neither rushed nor stalled, but inevitable in its unfolding. The institutions he had established were already bearing fruit. Universities now offered courses in ancient Egyptian mathematics and astronomy, alongside modern engineering. Libraries in Cairo and Alexandria and smaller cities were being stocked with translations of classical texts that had been gathering dust in private collections for generations. The government had created fellowships for young Egyptians to study their own heritage with the same rigor that Western scholars had long applied to it. But the greatest transformation was not visible in buildings or programs. It was in the eyes of the people. Amara had traveled throughout the country during these 12 months, from the Mediterranean coast to Aswan, and everywhere he went, he saw something shifting in the national consciousness. Young people who had once felt disconnected from their own history now wore it with pride. Craftspeople were reviving traditional methods of weaving and pottery. Farmers were learning about the irrigation techniques of ancient times while also adopting sustainable modern practices. There was no contradiction in this embrace of both worlds. In his private chambers at night, Amara would sometimes remove the formal clothes of his office and sit in simple garments, much like those he had worn in his village. He would read by candlelight, reviewing reports from the various institutions, but also reading poetry and philosophy written thousands of years ago. These moments of solitude reminded him of the essence of his journey, how far the path had wound, but how deeply rooted it remained in something timeless. His family had adapted to the palace with grace. His mother, now elderly and dignified, spent her days in the gardens, sometimes speaking with visitors about life in the village, grounding even the most distinguished guests in the reality of where Egypt truly lived. His children attended school with other children from across the country, learning not only from textbooks but from the cultural programs he had instituted. They understood that their father's role was a responsibility to something far greater than any individual. The challenges remained abundant. Economic inequality had not vanished with a change in leadership. Infrastructure still needed development. The relationship between tradition and modernity was sometimes tense, sometimes harmonious, always requiring careful navigation. Amara did not pretend these difficulties would resolve themselves. Instead, he worked methodically, surrounding himself with advisors who understood both the ancient wisdom of Egypt and the contemporary needs of its people. What sustained him through the difficulties was a simple understanding that had crystallized during his shepherd days and only deepened through everything that followed. Egypt was not a problem to be solved, but a living entity to be served. Its past was not a museum piece, but a living force that could inform every decision about its future. The same principles that had allowed ancient civilizations to build monuments and manage vast agricultural systems could guide modern governance if applied with intelligence and compassion. As the anniversary of his inauguration approached, Amara stood once again in the Hall of Memory, this time with a group of students from a rural school. He watched their faces as they discovered artifacts and read stories, watched them understand for perhaps the first time that they were not separate from history but continuous with it. A young girl asked him why he had built this place, and he knelt down to meet her at eye level. He told her that every person carries something ancient within them, something that connects them to everyone who came before. A leader's role was simply to help people remember what they already knew deep in their hearts. Amara's vision was not to return to what was, but to remember what was timeless and eternal within the Egyptian spirit, and let it guide the way forward. In the palace library, surrounded by texts both ancient and new, Amara sometimes wondered where the simple boy of the village had gone. The afternoon light filtered through high windows, casting long shadows across shelves that held centuries of knowledge. And in those quiet moments, he allowed himself to drift back to memories that seemed impossibly distant yet vividly present. He could still feel the dust of the village paths beneath his feet, still hear the bleating of sheep that had been his constant companions during those early mornings before dawn broke across the desert. The boy who had tended those flocks with nothing but a staff and the vast Egyptian sky above him felt like someone from another lifetime, someone he might read about in these very texts surrounding him. Yet that boy lived within him still, whispering reminders of simplicity and truth. Amara ran his fingers along the spine of an ancient manuscript, feeling the worn leather beneath his touch. The transformation had not happened all at once, he realized. It had unfolded gradually, like the opening of a lotus flower in still water. Each step, each challenge, each moment of doubt and discovery had added another layer to who he was becoming. The village elder who first recognized something different about him, the mentor who taught him to read the stars and understand the patterns of the land, the teachers who showed him the weight of history and the possibility of tomorrow. They had all been part of a design he could not have understood as a child. When he looked at his hands now, hands that signed decrees and made decisions affecting millions, he sometimes saw the hands of that shepherd boy. They were the same hands that had learned to work, to create, to build something meaningful from nothing. The calluses were gone, replaced by the soft smoothness that came from a life lived within stone walls and silk robes, yet the strength remained unchanged. It came from somewhere deeper than the surface, something forged in those early years under an unforgiving sun. The journey from shepherd to sovereign had taught him something profound about the nature of growth. It was not about leaving behind who you were, but about expanding the vessel that held you. The boy of the village had not been wrong or incomplete. He had simply been young, unburdened by the weight of knowledge that now rested on Amara's shoulders. That boy had possessed clarity, directness, and an instinctive understanding of what truly mattered. He had known the value of work, the reality of consequences, and the importance of caring for those who depended on you. Now, as a leader responsible for the welfare of his nation, Amara found himself returning again and again to those early lessons. When faced with difficult choices, when ministers presented him with complex problems that seemed to have no perfect solutions, he would close his eyes and remember the simplicity of tending sheep. In that act, there was no pretense, no politics, no elaborate reasoning. There was only the clear-eyed awareness of what needed to be done and the commitment to do it with integrity. The library seemed to hold its breath around him, as if the accumulated wisdom of ages was listening to his thoughts. He thought of the pharaohs whose likenesses graced the ancient walls of temples and tombs, men born into power and crowned almost before they could walk. What had they known of the journey he had taken? What could they have understood about the transformation that came from rising, not from a throne, but from the earth itself? He understood now that the vision he carried forward was stronger because of where he had come from. The people of Egypt needed a leader who remembered what it meant to struggle, to doubt, to work with your own hands for survival. They needed someone who had felt the weight of responsibility not as something bestowed by birthright, but as something earned through dedication and sacrifice. As evening began to settle over the palace, casting the library in softer, warmer tones, Amara stood and moved toward the window. Somewhere beyond these walls lay the village of his childhood, still much the same, still holding fast to its ancient rhythms. But he knew the answer. That boy had not disappeared, but had grown, expanded, and learned to hold within himself both the humility of his origins and the responsibility of his throne. The lights of Cairo twinkled below like earthbound stars, each one representing a life, a dream, a hope placed in his hands. Amara stood alone on the highest palace terrace, the night air cool against his skin, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and river water. Behind him, the great halls of power lay in peaceful slumber, their marble corridors empty of the day's endless processions and council sessions. Before him stretched the vast expanse of the city he had come to know so intimately, yet which still held infinite mysteries within its ancient folds. He thought of the shepherd boy who had stood in these same sands decades ago, tending his small flock, knowing nothing of the world that lay beyond the horizon. That boy had possessed a clarity of purpose that the man now possessed as well, though the journey between them had been long and winding, filled with doubts and discoveries he could never have imagined. The transformation had not been one of replacement, but of accumulation. Each experience, each failure, each moment of grace had been sewn into the fabric of who he was. His hand rested against the cool stone of the parapet, and he allowed his mind to drift across the decisions that awaited him. There were rivers to manage, education systems to rebuild, the ancient heritage to preserve while embracing the needs of a modern world. The responsibility was immense, yet he no longer felt its weight as a burden crushing down upon his shoulders. Instead, it had become something else entirely, something closer to purpose, to meaning, to the reason his feet had walked this particular path through life. The promise he had made to himself all those years ago, sitting beneath the stars in the desert silence, had been simple: to never forget where he came from, to never lose sight of the faces of the ordinary people whose struggles had shaped his own. That promise remained as true now as it had been then. Perhaps it was even more vital now, when the temptations of power could so easily obscure the vision that had brought him here. He recalled the faces of those he had left behind in his village, the friends who had doubted, the elders who had warned him, the mother whose sacrifice had made his rise possible. They lived in his decisions every single day. When he chose mercy over vengeance, when he listened to the counsel of those with no power, when he walked through the poorest quarters of the city and truly saw the people there, he was honoring all of them. His crown was not his alone. It belonged to every person whose hand had guided him, every voice that had spoken truth into his life, every moment of ordinary grace that had accumulated into this extraordinary responsibility. Cairo beneath him pulsed with the rhythm of millions of hearts beating through the night. Some were celebrating, some were grieving, some were working through the darkness, some were dreaming dreams they had not yet dared to speak aloud. All of them deserved a leader who understood this diversity of human experience, who could hold space for both the joy and the sorrow, the hope and the struggle. The night sky above him was crowded with stars, just as it had been during those shepherd days. They looked the same, burned with the same ancient light, yet his understanding of them had changed entirely. He knew now that he was part of something vast and eternal, that his reign would occupy but a small space in Egypt's infinite timeline. The pharaohs who had come before him had looked up at these same stars and made their own promises. The rulers who would come after him would do the same. This understanding brought not diminishment but liberation. His task was not to achieve permanence, but to serve faithfully in his appointed time. He turned his face to the night, feeling the vast weight of history and the extraordinary lightness of possibilities simultaneously. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy. But tonight, in this moment of solitude on the palace height, he allowed himself to simply be present to the magnitude of the gift he had been given. And as the ancient desert breeze carried the whispers of 10,000 years across the city, Amara made his silent promise to the gods, to the people, to the very soul of Egypt itself, that he would be worthy of the crown, and that together, they would write a future as magnificent as the pyramids that watched over them all.